So yeah, today we're going to talk about performance slips on clay, and I will be trying to, I think this audience is very well disposed already on this concept, but I will try to show you that psycholinguistic typology is the best fit to understanding scribal errors in the linear B corpus. But just so that we are all on the same page on what we're talking about today, I'll just give a few words of introduction on Mycenaean Greek and its script. So this is usually, the chronological horizon of alphabetic Greek and the, standard periodization. And here is where one would put the earliest attestation of alphabetic Greek, so the Dipylon inscription, which I give you just, to have a visual component of it. But, when we're talking about Mycenaean Greek, we are actually making a larger historical leap, and we're going back across the Iron Age to the late Bronze Age. And this is basically the period of attestation of Linear B, and therefore Mycenaean Greek, that is between 1400 and 1200, more or less, of course, BCE. And this gives you, the size of the chronological leap that one does when comparing the earliest attestation of alphabetic Greek with the attestation of Linear B. So it's considerable, and we're talking about a stage of Greek that's pretty archaic, and also a completely different writing system. This is what it looks like. And so even though that alphabetic inscription on the Dipylon Oikoe was already kind of hard to, decipher, maybe this is a much different, somewhat more difficult writing system, at least for the notation of the Greek language. These are the sites where Linear B is attested. So many sites across continental Greece. Mostly one on Crete, but with some attestation, scattered around the island as well. Today we will be mostly talking about Pylos and Knossos as big, corpora of Linear B. And that's what I was referencing. So Knossos in the center of the island is where, the biggest archive is found. But we have some attestation of Linear B also in the western and eastern parts of the island at Chania and Malia. So how does Linear B works? It's a logosyllabary. So we have both syllabograms that notate syllabic sequences and logograms that notate entire words or notions. Historically, it's an adaptation of Linear A, that is the script used by the Minoans on Crete, to the notation of the Greek language. So it's an adaptation, and by definition, it's not going to be a perfect match, as we will see. Of course, we all know by now that Linear B notates the Greek language. It is attested on clay tablets, mostly, but also on ceilings and vases, all part of the administrative network of the Mycenaean palaces in the late Bronze Age. So our texts are not going to be very fun, but mostly lists of stuff or animals and people, but they're very interesting linguistically. This is the syllabary, so just the syllabic signs of Linear B. On the left, you have the core syllabary, 89 signs. As you can see, it notates open syllables. So we either have syllabograms that notate just vocalic sounds or syllables ending in vowels. And on the right, we have the so-called complex signs or doublets that are, optional variants that the scribes may use to represent more specific phonological contrasts than the standard syllabary. This is just, an example of the logographic component of Linear B. As you can see, we have the logograms are mostly very iconic, and we have logograms for, types of animals, commodities, arms, medals, and chariots and stuff like that. Everything that can, have to do with the palatial administration of the late Bronze Age. As I was saying, Linear B only includes syllabograms for open syllables, so the sign shapes are vowel, consonant, or consonant, vowel. So this poses a problem for the notation of consonant clusters in Greek, which are abundant. So we have basically three main strategies. The best, but not the most widespread, is just the use of complex signs when they are available. So, for example, since we have a complex sign for due, we can represent the cluster due in the word termiduen just with one sign that represents exactly that sequence of consonants. The thing is, complex signs are limited. The safely deciphered one are the ones that I bold-faced, so due, duo, tue, tuo, noa, and pta. As you can see, there is a tendency to notate labialized or palatalized sequences of sorts. And on the bottom line, we have some likely suggestions for technically undeciphered signs that can be complex. As you can see, it's a very limited set, so we don't usually have this spelling strategy. And even when a complex sign is available, the scribes may still resort to an analytical, notation as it were. So sometimes consonant sounds in clusters are just omitted, simply. So it's up to us to, reconstruct them based on what we know about Greek. So for example, the word for table, torpeza, is just lacking the notation of the R, which we, reconstruct comparatively, knowing what the table word looks like elsewhere in Greek. As I was saying, the so-called progressive notation, where we have all elements of the cluster notated, with the use of an empty or dummy vowel. So, for example, in analiptos, the phonological vowel is only one. We have only one phonological O, but both elements of the clusters are represented, just repeating that O vowel, even when it's not actually there. And this is the so-called analytical notation that I was talking about, and we can find this notation even when a complex sign is available. So this is by far the most widespread strategy. So this is how the writing system works, which of course facilitates a lot of scribal errors just by its systematic features. Of course, Linear B also does not notate features that are meaningful and contrastive in Greek. So there's no way to notate accent, vowel length, and consonant gemination. There is no distinction between a lateral and a rhotic liquid. So we transcribe everything with R just by convention. Also, we have no systematic way of notating voicing and aspiration of stops. We just have a distinction between the voiced dental and the voiceless, either aspirate or unaspirated. And maybe we have some distinction also in the labial series, but that's less clear. But Linear B, thankfully, does notate some features of Greek, and some of them are even archaic, so that gives us a good, window into the history of the language. So we have a full series for labiovelar stops, so Q, basically, and we have a full Q series. The glides that are later lost in most dialects of Greek are still represented, with some variation, but mostly they're there. So we have a series for the Y and the W glide. Sometimes aspiration is notated, and almost always, or in the majority of cases, the second elements of diphthongs are also notated faithfully. So this was the introduction about the writing system, and it will be handy later when we see actual examples of scribal errors. What I'm gonna do today is just present and discuss the previous critical and typological approaches to linear B scribal errors. including the typologies that have already been formulated and that are there in the literature. And then I will, present a sample studies that originally goes back to my MA thesis, and then I have reworked in various occasions, and also a working typology, not necessarily a typology that works, but I'll be welcoming your feedback on it. And then I will, mention my present and future research endeavors on scribal errors. If we have time, which probably we won't, so it's an appendix. We can also see one example of a scribal error that I've been working on recently that is very meaningful for our understanding of, uh, the grammar of Mycenaean, or at least a grammatical feature of Mycenaean Greek compared to later Greek. So, okay, I just like to open with, this quote from Michel Lejeune that basically says that everything that, I've done and that we're doing is basically pointless because, studying errors, as a whole is just, just a waste of time. But I'm happy to contradict him. But it is true that to this day there is no dedicated study on scribal errors in linear B, at least a comprehensive one. And I hope I can make it happen in the future. But still, the concept of scribal error has been used in linear B studies previously, mostly in connection to problematic features in the grammar of Mycenaean. So, for example, maybe the earliest one is by Chadwick, that basically is challenging a proposal by Luria that sees in a bunch of weird genitives that are lacking the actual, morpheme for a genitive that would be the yo part. So Luria just proposes that we have a different ending for these genitives, and Chadwick just basically considers all these sequences as omissions. So every contextually determined genitive that is lacking the morpheme is just going to be a scribal error. And Chadwick thinks that this can be actually a good idea given the status of the linear B documents, because he, I think, correctly states that they are very different from, manuscripts, on which we rely for the study of First Millennium Greek and even inscriptions, but they should be equated with papyri for the most part, in that, the editors have to emendate a lot and assume a very high frequency of errors. Therefore, Chadwick is more comfortable in admitting a large number of scribal errors rather than making generalizations on the grammar of Mycenaean. On a similar note, Ilieski challenged another proposal by Levin, whereby there would be some non-Greek inflectional elements in Mycenaean, and in the same way, Ilieski just says, no, all these are just scribal errors. We cannot project this into our grammatical descriptions of Mycenaean Greek, because basically the material itself is just too uncertain and complicated that it's too unsafe to do so. So the skepticism continues in even studies devoted to all of some scribal errors, because, for example, Perpillu only decides to consider errors those that are explicitly corrected by the scribes. So when you can see philologically and paleographically that the scribes has erased a sequence and has written over in rasura, that then only that is an error, because Perpillu is basically applying the opposite logic of Chadwick and Ilievsky, whereby if something doesn't match the expectations of a modern philologist or missinologist, that's not enough to consider a form a scribal error. We should just, accept what's there on the text and try to explain it in a different way. But only where there is a visible correction can we safely say that we're dealing with an error. Therefore, there have been attempts to formulate some objective, criteria to understand when something is an error or not. So, of course, the main source of typological analytical tools has been classical philology, and we see it in, for example, Maurice's attempt. So this is basically how, scribal errors have been treated until, Consani's monograph, who is the first to basically introduce a psycholinguistic typology to describe, scribal errors, and also to equate the type of errors that we see in the linear B texts to those detected in, modern day speech corpora. So Consani also proposes some quantitative and distributional surveys of the errors in the two main corpora, so Knossos and Pylos. And we will see them in a second. So three scholars basically have proposed typologies. One of them is Ilievsky that I mentioned. And his typology is very descriptive in that he captures basically all of the phenomenology of errors that we can find in the linear B texts. However, I'm not a fan of his distinguishing criteria. Because he, for example, has three categories. The first one is changes, the second is omissions, and the third is additions. I get it that, one thing is changing what the content of the sequence is. One is just omitting something, and one category is just the addition of it. I see the structural differentiation, but going back to the changes, we have basically a lot of different phenomena under the same label. So we have, confusions due to the similarity of signs. We have sound substitutions. We have metathesis of sounds, and even grammatical confusion. So, wrong gender, number or case, or even person, markers. So everything under, just the broad category of changes. And then, omissions and additions are separate categories, but are mostly just orthographic or, graphic errors, because, we have haplographies or ditographies or, unmotivated omissions that do not seem to have, any linguistic connection or otherwise. But it's a good descriptive tool, to know what's going on in the text. Then we have Maurice's typology that, as I said, is based on, the classical philology practice, basically. And also in our nomenclature, we have, material errors. So we have, the mentioned graphic slips, just due to the similarity between signs, and again, omissions and additions that under her typology are under the same category. This would correspond to, the mechanical lapsus of classical philology. And then she distinguishes, errors due to perturbations of the internal dictation of the scribes. And so these would, manifest themselves as, substitutions of either a part of, either, the vocalic or consonantal component of a sign, or the whole sign with the wrong one. And also somehow contaminations of lexical elements. So maybe a step forward in the macroscopic distinctions between errors, but still different processes under the same labels. But I think the most interesting part of her typology, and I think it's one that it's a keeper. It's something that any typology should be able to capture, is that, of course, these documents are bound to be affected by the conditions under which they are composed. And these conditions are sometimes clumsy and fragmented. So we can have, one single record, one single registration that's fragmented across multiple tablets. So that's gonna favor, errors or slips or confusions or so. In the same way, we can have one single document that deals with different subjects. So this fragmentation can also favor some errors. Or we also have multiple ends that are working on the same document, or even different internal sections of the tablet that that are written at different times. So, the syntactic unity of these texts can be perturbed. So I think this is the best part of her, typology. And I'm sorry, this is just very, abstract, but we will see examples and texts in a moment. It's just I know I'm talking to people that have thought about errors a lot, so you can, follow me and you already know what looks like a good typology or not. And then, this is basically the typology that underlies Consani's, distributional analysis. So the table continues in the next slide. But by the way, first of all, he distinguishes between, graphic errors, those driven by the, graphic nature and morphology of the signs itself. So the sign shape, or as I was mentioning in my introduction, when the scribe has the option to use a doublet or a complex sign, and then that can, trigger some further confusion when choosing between different spelling strategies for the same sequences, or even the fact even the use of logograms can trigger or can be, subject to some slips. Then he has this category of just linguistic errors, not psycholinguistic yet, just linguistic. And I get he's just referring to those that affect very, very transparently the linguistic structure of sequences. So either in the phonetic, morphological, or lexical domain. And then finally, we get to the psycholinguistic category, according to him. He has a relatively limited, range of process procedures. He talks about perseveration, anticipation, and omission are, the only psycholinguistic categories, and he identifies quite a lot. So this is, I think, the most, significant innovation. Also, of course, he compares the total number of errors of all categories to, the size of this corpora. So it's remarkable that with such a high number of tablets, maybe we don't find as many errors as we'd expect, according at least to his estimates. And also the fact that in the Knossos corpus, even though it's, 3 times the Pylos one, we have half the total number of errors. So Consani just basically connects it with a higher care in writing that would be, applied at Knossos. But also, I think it depends on what type of texts we find in this corpora, because at Pylos we have a huge amount of land tenure texts. They are very long, they're very formulaic, and they are more prone to, mistakes. So it depends also, on the content and the style, as it were, of the documents that one has in the corpus. So Consani's typology, moving on to the following section, is my methodological starting point for, or has been for my MA thesis, and also for another conference paper that I gave in 2022. And the core assumption that, the linear B corpus is comparable to, present day speech corpora in terms of the types of errors that we detect. The theoretical framework that I have used, maybe it has been, updated, but it still goes back to Fromkin's works. So linear B scribal errors would be taken as performance slips using her, words. And I have compared them to the, types of errors found in the UCLA SE corpus of lapses, and, found some interesting matches that I'm about to show you. Of course, we have to justify comparing these types of data. There are, at first so disparate and so different between each other, of course. But even though we are dealing with one corpus of, clay tablets burned in fires 3 millennia ago and present day speech corpora, there are some similarities because linear B tablets were annotated, simultaneously with other administrative activities. There was no textual planning, so we can assume a highly spontaneous production of the linguistic material on these inscriptions. And to be fair, the officials who annotated the tablets were not scribes the way we intend them to be. They were just officials that paid attention to all the economic and administrative processes within palaces and also were able to write and would use writing next to other activities as they were being carried on. They were not, the Egyptian kind of, scribes that we are used to picture in our minds. And there are also some archaeological records that show us how, palatial administration would work and how these people would move, inside the palaces. And for example, we have some linear B tablet deposits that are found within, warehouses and workshops, for example, at Pylos. And they are often in archaeological association with the products that we see then recorded. So, for example, we have an inventory of vases at Pylos, and archaeologists have found both the vases and the written record on the tablet next to it. So, that's archaeological proof that these people would go across the palace, look at stuff, and then annotate the clay as they were looking at them. So we can also assume that the data for the annotation would come from different, um, sources. So either from, oral communication, but also from the visual memory of the official, or even from the immediate verification in situ, as I was saying. So both the visual and auditory chains were activated when they were composing these texts. So based on these premises, I think we can safely assume that psycholinguistic mechanisms were at work in these texts. And of course, this is just to give you, like, as a test, what just a mere lapsus calami would look like, and the so-called graphic errors that Consani and others have identified. So, for example, in Pylos UN 718, this is a text on, as I said, very fun fiscal contributions. And we have the word for unguent, aleifar, that is written in linear B as arepa. And we find it, misspelled as arero. As you can see, it's in blue on the text. And, what do you see to the right of the first spelling with the little pluses is a ligature. So, funny enough, the scribe made a mistake in the spelling of the fully spelled out form, but then still wrote the correct sign in the ligature version of it. So we have arero and then arepa as a smaller, ligature. And the culprit is just the second horizontal stroke in the syllabogram, as you can see on the right. So pa would need a second horizontal stroke, and ro just has one. So here it's probably, the similarity between signs, or the scribe did not bother to, wrote the second horizontal stroke. So that's very, very easily the reason for the lapsus calami. But then things, become more interesting when we can see some comparanda with modern day speech corpora. So if we take as an example of an anticipation the UCLA SE uh, error in this slide. So the error utterance is, and yeah, it looks really good. Here we have an anticipation of the R to the of really to the preceding looks. So something of the same type is happening in the Mycenaean text on the bottom of the slide. So in Pylos UN 616, which is a list of commodities for the perfume industry of Pylos, we would expect, the sequence Cuparios to be written as Cupa-Ro-2, but we have Cu-Ro-Ro-2. So in this case, it's rather the, phonetic content that is being anticipated. There's nothing going on with the graphic shape of syllabograms, but probably it's just the R segment that has been anticipated and has, produced a misspelling of the preceding syllabogram. So we have, ro instead of pa. We also have the opposite, pattern. So we have cases of perseveration. For example, in the example at the top of the slide, this week's instead of week, I received it for a target utterance of this week, I received it. In this case, we have the perseveration of the final segment S of this into the following week. And something similar is happening in the linear B text at the bottom of the slide. This is one of my favorite examples also because it's kind of unclear what's going on. It is clear that this text wants on each line a genitive followed by a plural noun in the nominative or accusative plural that means something like pieces of fragments. So in line 2, for example, we have caso, which don't know what it means, but we know it's contextually a genitive. And then we have kemata, which stands for kermata, which is another way to say fragments or pieces. And it's in the neuter plural. In the first line, we have a genitive, elephantos, meaning of ivory, and then we have karamato. We would expect for the neuter plural a final ta, so klasmata, pieces, but still we have a wrong o in that position, and this definitely looks like a perseveration of what is kind of more difficult to say. It could be just, graphically the to syllabogram being repeated from erepato to karamato. It can be just the vocalism of the vowel at the phonological level. So from, elephantos klasmata, we have just the vocalism of the O that's being, perseverated, or even the morpheme. So elephantos klasmatos, for example. We have no way to, prove it because of the difficulty of the text, but at least, the fact that we are dealing with a perseveration is kind of clear. Of course, we also have errors that affect the lexical, level of articulation. So we have, like cases of lexical blend. As a comparandum, I give you, Bourgelot, which is a blend of Burgundy, Beaujolais, and Bordeaux. And the speaker has taken, one syllable from each of these color names and made them in and has, smushed them into just one word. And it's similar to what is happening on, Pylos EP 613, where we have, this weird looking form a si to po quo. So we have this form or the target form for this spelling attested elsewhere in Mycenaean. So we have the form artopokuos, that means baker. But we also know that, there is a second word in Greek for bread. So let me just say that this is a compound. So we have artopokos. Arto is the stem for bread in one case. And we can safely say that in Mycenaean there must have been also a compound sitopokos. It's unattested, but sitos was the other Greek word for bread just as artos. So Poquos could just be a lexical blend between these two, synonyms, let's say, that describe us smushed together in the first part of the compound and has created a sitopoquo instead of either atopoquo for artopoquos or sitopoquo for sitopoquos. Um, Again, another type of error that is found in the linear B tablets is still affecting the lexical, level, but is a substitution. So in the UCLA SEC example, I give you what makes you competent, well, confident in the figures for a target utterance of what makes you confident in the figures. In this case, the lexical substitution is driven by the similar, first syllable of the two adjectives, so competent and confident. And this is exactly what is going on the linear B text that I give you, so Knossos BGH17, which is a list of adult workers and their sons. So this is a case of error corrected by the scribe. So we see that the scribe has written Kusu for Ksun, and then initially has written pate for pantes, that would mean altogether, xum pantes, but then decided that xum pantes in this context was not appropriate. So he basically erased the two syllabograms pate and wrote in rasura to roqua, thus obtaining the sequence kusu to roqua, which we read as xum stroqua. That is functionally a synonym, but it's an adverb that means in total. So for some reason, the scribe judged this not appropriate and then corrected it. But we can see that probably the same the homophony of these two words at their beginning may have driven this lexical substitution that was then corrected. Another type of lexical substitution in this case is driven by the two terms being antonyms between each other. So we have in Pylos SH 734, which is a list of armors, the two adjectives for, bigger and smaller. And in all of the tablets in this series, the scribes write the bigger word first, the bigger attachment first, and then the smaller ones. For some reason, that may be anticipation, maybe, the scribe had started writing the smaller word me u yoa in place of the first, and then realized it, erased the second syllabogram that he had written so far, and then proceeded to write in rasura mezzo a two, and then continued the text and placed the spelling for the smaller word in the right place. So that's why we finally have 22 bigger attachments, 22 smaller attachments. But initially it was perturbing the order of these two adjectives, which we know that for some reason this was the formulaic order. So this gives you just a sample of all the process procedures that one can identify in the text, and with striking, to my mind at least, parallels with present day corpora, with the same process procedures and also the same factors driving the genesis of these errors, sometimes with corrections, sometimes not. It's interesting to see that corrections are pretty frequent when the lexical level is involved, more often than when lower, let's say, levels like phonological and morphological ones are involved in the error. So based on this and some more forms in my MA thesis, I proposed a new working typology that I think is more solidly grounded in psycholinguistic typology, and that can help us describe what's going on better. So I think that essentially we need more than just one parameters. So it's a typology that's gonna move across two axes. One of these axes distinguishes between lexical and sublexical errors. This is, I think, a working distinction in psycholinguistics. And I think it's confirmed by the data because as we saw, even with the very small sample that I showed you today, it's not always possible to isolate the precise sublexical level involved in the slip. So yes, we saw an example of perseveration, but we didn't know if it was on the orthographic level or on the phonological or on the morphological, but it was obvious that we were dealing with a perseveration. And some types of process procedures cluster with sublexical and lexical errors separately. So in the sublexical domain, we have a lot of anticipation, perseveration, exchange, and so on, which is, I think, why Consani only had a limited set of categories in his own psycholinguistic section. But we saw that in the lexical domain we have other procedures. So we have substitution, blend that are just not possible elsewhere. So I think that lexical versus sublexical is the working distinction, and then of course we can go we can narrow it down further in a descriptive manner, but functionally this should be the distinction. And also I want to keep, as I said, something that belonged in Maurice's typology, which is the attention to what's going on with these texts and how they're being produced, and how the circumstances in which are being produced affects the production of the text and therefore of the errors. So I distinguished between production, reception, and I don't have a good word for the third category. Let's say compilation or composition. I don't know, errors. So they are based on what part of the writing process is involved or is interacting or interfering with the genesis of the errors. So if it's a production error, it means that the internal dictation of the scribe is involved, or there is something in the code text that is interfering with the error and the erroneous utterance. Or reception errors are those where maybe an auditory or visual interference can be detected. So it's something that's happening, outside of the textual production proper, and maybe linked to how the scribe may be receiving that information, and that then is going later on the text, or something that can be linked to a discontinuous writing process. This is going to be the case for syntactic errors, or cases where the syntactic agreement is not respected on the text. For example, it seems to cluster with cases where the scribe had to stop writing, or likely had to stop writing, and there was a break in the writing flow. So these are the categories that I used back in the day, and I will put to test again in the present or very near future. But again, this is just another one in the mix that I think is pushes even forward Constantine's idea of psycholinguistic errors in these texts. So what am I going to do, in the present or near future and beyond? So I'm currently, finishing my dissertation that is technically on Greek and Indo-European syllabification, but with an attention also to the writing component of syllabification, and of course, linear being a syllabic script. has always been taken as a window into how syllables were defined in the Greek grammar. I have a chapter currently developing on scribal errors as evidence of phonological processing. So again, I'm pushing my claim even further. So since speech errors are crucial in experimental phonology, I wonder what we can infer from these errors on the text about the phonology of Mycenaean and Greek in general. I also am working on collecting more data and extend previous surveys. For example, since Consani surveyed, provided quantitative surveys for Pylos and Knossos, the natural, continuation would be covering the Thebes corpus, which is the third by extension, but is still, manageable in terms of, number of documents. I think we're dealing with 300 documents or something like that, which is something that one could do in a dissertation chapter. So probably that's where I will land on a dissertation. But looking ahead at the in the future, I still would like to come up with a monograph on scribal errors. I would like it to be a reference work with a comprehensive collection of errors with the potential for creating maybe an online repository and or a digital corpus of errors. And in the field, at least of Mycenaean studies, people have started to propose that we use Epidoc also to create editions of the linear B texts. And I think that this would be a very nice, integration, because of course with Epidoc you can annotate your texts in a much richer way than standard editions. So I think that this would be nice to explore. But beyond, the purely, anecdotic and philological domain, a work on scribal errors, as I think you will agree, has broader cultural implications. And in this case, in the Bronze Age Aegean, there is still a lingering question among archaeologists about Crete mostly. So who were the people that were using Mycenaean Greek and Linear B? Of course, it's a Greek language, but who were the users of this language? And many people think that the administrators remained Minoans, even though the elite, the leading elite were Mycenaeans. So these people would be essentially Minoans that have learned, Greek as a language and have adapted their own script to notate it and are still, keeping records of the administration instead of being, Greek speakers, Greek native speakers, let's say. So this is, a big question, and I think this work on errors can be insightful because, one distinction that we can make is between errors that derive from a suboptimal competence. So what we'd find in a non-native speaker who's learning the language or who hasn't acquired a fully functional competence in that language, and performance errors that we all make, even though we have a perfect competence in our native language, we still make performance slips that still do not imply a broken or suboptimal competence. So I think that if my work really meets its mark and I have satisfying results, I think we could draw the line on what type of competence the errors on the text can indicate, can suggest. So this is basically my desiderata for the future research. So this is what I have for the essential part of my presentation. I think we're on time or right on it. So I will leave it back to Simona. Thank you for now. I have more if you want. I have an appendix with some other material, but I will stop for a sec now.